Hello, my friends. Welcome to Origins. Origins is a forum that uses the evidence of science to validate the truth of creation. My name's Donn Chapman, and it's my privilege to be your host. And today we have a guest with us, a tremendous guest, a man who has become a friend of mine because we have such a common perspective on what the church needs to be doing and where the world is. Welcome, Brad Harrub, here to be with us today. Brad is a PhD in anatomy and neurobiology from the University of Tennessee School of Medicine, and he is the co-founder of Focus Press. Currently, Dr. Harrub is the director of Focus Press and the co-editor of Think magazine. Brad, I love your magazine. I love the cover, and I especially love the title, Think. Is your title kind of suggesting that not everybody in America is doing a lot of that these days?
That's exactly right, Don. We're wanting folks to start thinking critically, to really look at the evidence before them.
You know, our show today is about the fact that there's a difference between education and indoctrination. It seems to me that Think has something to say to that.
Definitely. If you really think about it for just a moment, our kids are running off to school, and oftentimes, instead of being educated to think critically or to learn how to learn, they are being indoctrinated or simply learning trivial facts so that they can take standardized testing.
Now, it seems to me that an educated person is a person who has learned to think critically, to take in information, evaluate that information, and make intelligent, logical decisions. Would you agree with that?
I would agree. And
it would seem to me that whether you were a secular humanist or a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist or whatever, that would be something that would appeal to you, that we would want to be raising thinking people.
You would think so, and yet if you look at the system as it's designed right now, most of our kids, they go through 12 years of schooling, and yet they really don't know how to think critically.
Now, our title today is Evolution Indoctrination. That a part of this process of teaching our children just to think as they're told to think and not to really think for themselves is the whole system of evolution. Has that always been the case in America?
No, not at all. In fact, if you think with me for just a moment, you know, if we were to walk down the hallway 30, 40 years ago, maybe in the 1940s, 50s, you know, the common problems during a classroom setting would be something like maybe chewing gum or cutting in line or somebody speaking without raising their hand.
I knocked over a trash can once.
Exactly. And you know, the discipline was there, the education was there. It was a totally different environment. But if we fast forward to 2007, 2008, 2009, and we look at what our young people are going through today, we know, for instance, there's security monitors all throughout schools. We know our kids are having to leave home early just to get through metal detectors. And we know it's a normal ritual nowadays for them to have drug dogs running up and down the hallways. Definitely, you know, a different environment from what little Billy or little Johnny had 50, 60 years ago and what he's facing today. In
fact, there's probably some naivete among parents because they envision the school being as it was, and that's not what it is anymore, is it?
And you know, a lot of parents, myself included, we are products of a public school education. There was a time where, you know, it was a great thing to say, hey, you know, America, we've got a great public education. Today, things are different.
It's different.
I want us to look at that difference a little bit today.
I'm excited to talk to you about it. You know, it scares me when you talk about indoctrinating our children instead of educating our children, because as I look back over history of the 20th century, this isn't the first time this has been done. Usually it's done by people who are working towards a dictatorial kind of government.
That's right. In fact, Adolf Hitler once made the comment, he said, "Let me control the textbooks, and I will control the state." You know, he knew that if he was going to start a new world order, the first thing he had to do was infect the minds of the young people.
That's kind of scary. I've read of Stalin and Mao Zedong making very similar kinds of statements, that the one thing they were demanding early on in their dictatorship was to be able to control what went into the minds of children. And you're saying that's basically what's happening today in our public schools?
You know, if you look at exactly what Hitler was trying to get across to the older generation, he went on at one point to comment, he said, when an opponent declares, "I will not come over to your side," I calmly say, "Your child belongs to us already. What are you? You will pass on. Your descendants, however, now stand in the new camp, and in a short time they will know nothing else but this new community." You know, Hitler made it plain parents, adults, we don't really care what you think, because we're going to be able to make our changes with this next generation.
You know, Brad, that puts chills down my back, because when I read Hitler saying your child belongs to us already, I think of the motto at MTV, which is "We own this generation."
That's right.
And so that's not a Christian perspective coming out of MTV.
Exactly.
It's a total hedonistic perspective. And they're saying, we don't really care what you folks over 30 or 35 or 40 think. We already own your kids.
That's exactly right.
And that's pretty ominous.
You know, if you think back in history, it hasn't always been that way. Definitely here in the United States, there was a time where God, the Bible, Christianity were not only mentioned in the classroom, it was the norm. And yet you look at it today, and a lot of classrooms, they've silenced the pledge because it contains the phrase, "one nation under God." Prayers have long since ceased. And so instead, kids sit there and they discuss the debauchery they committed over the weekend and learn, you know, new foul language and other vile things.
And one of the books that sort of epitomizes the heritage of our nation was the McGuffey Reader.
Exactly. If you think back, maybe you look in your parents' or grandparents' attics, you find copies of a classic, McGuffey's Readers. There were actually 6 different readers that were published by William McGuffey, late 1800s. They were used in the early 1900s. Over 120 million of them were sold.
120 million.
Anybody who was learning to read during that time was using Mr. McGuffey's Readers.
And so, what was the worldview that was behind the McGuffey Reader? This kind of tells you where America was.
Definitely. I mean, all we have to do is open up, for instance, the second reader and take a look real quickly.
Now, would this be second grade?
This would be the second level. I'm not sure if they did grades the way we did.
But anyhow, after you finish the very first one, this is the second one.
Exactly. If you look at the chapter headings,
this is the table of contents.
The very first one there, praise to God.
Think of that.
We go on down towards the bottom. It talks about the Lord's Prayer. Over on the right, we have the 10 Commandments and about using profane language.
You know, it's to me, maybe how did we lose all this? I mean, it's incredible to me that this was the standard operating procedure for our country. And we've come to a point today where it seems to me people would be more upset, at least some people, the elitists in control, would be more upset that you were teaching people that A, there was a God, B, that you should praise Him, 3, that we should learn to pray, and 4, that there's right and wrong wrapped up in 10 statements God made. They're more concerned of that being taught than they are kids learning to use drugs or having sex outside of any, I was going to say marriage, but outside of any moral boundaries.
Yep.
Where did we go from good being called good to good being called evil?
You know, if you think back to the 1940s, 50s, 60s, there were some court decisions made where they started reversing what the idea of separation of church and state really was meant to insist. Originally, when Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Baptist Danbury Convention, he was telling them, look, the government's not going to interfere with the free exercise of the Christian religion.
That's right.
Today, we're being told we've got to get rid of, on the screen here, you see lessons that are teaching, for instance, about profanity or the 10 Commandments, and they're telling us we have to silence God in the classroom. We have to get rid of it.
Now, just so our folks don't think that this page is an aberration, take us through a little more of McGuffey's Reader.
Let's look at the third one, for instance. On the third reader, you'll notice highlighted here, we've got one on the goodness of God. And it's not just McGuffey. You look at, for instance, the Blueback Speller. Noah Webster wrote the Blueback Speller all the way back in the 1800s. And as young people, when they were learning basic word structures, you'll notice here, Donn, things like the Holy Bible is the book of God.
That was one of his definitions in his dictionary for.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Top of the page here, it says, good men obey the laws of God. God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and all that was made was very good. Now, think about planting those seeds in the hearts and the minds of a young person versus what we see today.
So once you get done with reading class, when you went to science class, you were already assuming that everything you were learning in science class was you were learning about the creation of God. Mm-hmm. And think of the different lens that gives you when you go to science class.
Couple more. Preacher is to preach the gospel. Here you notice basic word structure. They talk about Christ, Christian, and Christendom. And ironically, America was known as a Christian nation.
Yes.
Had you gone overseas, even if you were Muslim, Buddhist, whatever, if you uttered the phrase, "I'm from the United States," they assumed that you were Christian.
You know, Patrick Henry, one of our founders, said that this is a Christian nation. That doesn't mean everyone has to be a Christian, because one of the greatest virtues of Christendom is tolerance.
That's right.
That we accept people where they are, but they are not to affect the standard of who we are as a nation.
And yet now when you look at it, what is probably the most discriminated religion in the United States of America?
Oh, it's not even close.
That's right.
You can believe anything else. In fact, what all of the things that are happening in the school are about is to de-Christianize our children, I believe.
Exactly. And, you know, so we have a system in place now when we're talking about evolution indoctrination. We have a system where kids are memorizing surahs from the Quran, for instance, in the classroom, or they're memorizing the sayings of the Dalai Lama or Confucius, but you try to bring a Bible into that setting, and it's altogether a different picture.
And yet we still live in a day and age where that Gallup tells us that 85% of the people consider themselves Christian. I wish they were a little more Christian than they are, but it's amazing.
More vocal.
How and living it out a little more too.
Yes. Yeah.
But
we have some apathetic Christians
yes,
today.
we do, and we have some people who call themselves Christians, but there isn't much evidence. But the point that I'm trying to make is, I think it's an amazing thing to me that an elitist minority can so control an apathetic majority. So where are we in our schools today, Brad? I wonder if you'd want to go up to the board and just say, where are we today in what we're teaching our young people? McGuffey's Reader is a great perspective. It's a stake in the ground to say this is the way it was for, what, 100 years in America? Up through the 1920s at least? That was pretty much the standard reader, right?
That, and anybody in the public school system, that's what they were being exposed to. They learned not only the 3 R's of reading, writing, arithmetic, but they also were learning about God and the Bible.
Yes.
We look at today, and we find that, for instance, this biology book put out by Holt says, you're an animal, you share a common heritage with earthworms. Now, you can imagine a young person soaking that in, and it doesn't stop there. This is a Prentice Hall book used extensively. It says, we know, for example, that humans evolved from common ancestors we share with other living primates such as chimpanzees and apes.
And that is talked about as if it is just absolutely
fact.
Unquestionable fact.
They go on to say, like all other forms of life, humans are products of evolution by natural selection. You know, we haven't proven that. In fact, ironically, creationists, we believe in natural selection. We know that God uses that to weed out some of the unfit. Natural selection may explain the survival of the fittest, but it doesn't explain the arrival of the fittest.
No, that's right.
And yet here they are trying to tell us everything came from that particular procedure. This particular book says humans probably evolved from bacteria that lived more than 4 billion years ago.
We evolved from bacteria.
And then they have this wonderful little diagram to try to piece it together in our children and grandchildren's minds that, hey, we've got it all worked out. We know that we came from some sludge, from some primordial soup. This next one is put out by Arms and Camp. It's a biology book, and you'll notice it's got a picture of a human growing there in the womb. But notice what it says. It says, by the 7th month, the fetus looks from the outside like a tiny normal baby, but it's not.
This is another marketing ploy that they do. They take a picture. That little guy in that picture is less than 6 weeks old.
Definitely.
And yet they put his picture where they want the uneducated kids that we're raising to think that at 7 months, that's what that looks like.
Right.
At 7 months, a baby is viable.
That's right.
It can be outside the mother's womb, and it can live a very healthy and normal life.
That's the evil of marketing, so to speak, in that they're trying to get our kids to associate 7-month-old with, oh, well, it doesn't really look human, so maybe it's not.
And I just want to say that what you're saying, that's a perfect picture to illustrate your title, that this is indoctrination. We are not teaching science to our children. We're trying to get our children to devalue the baby in the womb.
That's exactly right.
Yes.
But it goes worse than that, Don. If you think about it for just a moment, we now have professors who are teaching young people that things like rape, adultery, murder, that they're perfectly acceptable. For instance, I want you to read with me what Randy Thornhill, a professor, was teaching a group of students at Simon Fraser University on the topic of rape. He said, rape is evolutionary, it's biological and natural. Rape itself is an adaptation, a product of direct selection for rape in the past. He said our male ancestors became ancestors in part because they conditionally used rape.
You know, if a student from his class went out that next weekend and raped a young lady from that college, I wonder if he could be charged as an accessory to the crime.
Exactly, because he's just pretty much given a rubber stamp that, hey, it's okay.
It's natural.
Yeah.
You're just doing what comes natural.
We have professors like Stephen Pinker who are saying, hey, if a mom takes an infant, throws it into an oven up until about the 6th month, she shouldn't be punished because, after all, she may just be trying to thin out the family as some kind of a survival mechanism that she evolved. These seeds will eventually produce some type of fruit. And if you think for just a moment, what kind of fruit are our kids going to be harvesting if they're thinking that rape is acceptable, that a 7-month-old in the womb is not really a human child? You know, you look 5-10 years out in the future and you can see what this indoctrination has really done. One of the sad parts is, Don, they're not waiting for our kids to get old enough really to defend themselves. I mean, on the screen you see book after book after book, science books, but if you think about it for just a moment, they are starting them literally in the 1st grade. You know, here we see a Merrill science book. It's for 1st graders. We open it up and we find the author saying the earth has changed much since its formation 4.5 billion years ago.
So we have an absolute fact. We know exactly when the earth started and how old it is.
And you've got a 6-year-old who is already coming to terms with their existence through a billion-year-old earth.
Yes, and there's no evidence for that. It's just stated like roses are red.
Well, and you think about it for just a moment. How many 1st graders do you know of who are going to question their textbook?
Well, they're not. That's the part of being that young, is that when they're little lambs, you can write anything on their heart.
So, Don, by 1st grade, children often have more atheistic seeds planted in their mind than they do seeds from God's Word. And, you know, it doesn't get any better. They run off to school 2nd grade, reinforcing the same thing. It says, since its formation 4.5 billion years ago, the earth has changed. Now, you know, here we have a 7-year-old child, and in fact, if you think about it for just a moment, the bottom of the page, you'll notice it says, in addition to these physical changes, life too has evolved on earth. And so we have a 7-year-old who is already coming to grips with his or her reality, how they got here, their origins, through an evolutionary perspective. Another textbook, Prentice Hall General Science book. It says, how was the universe born? How will it end? Most astronomers believe that about 18 to 20 billion years ago, all the matter in the universe was concentrated into one very dense, very hot region that may have been much smaller than a period on this page. For some unknown reason, this region exploded. This explosion is called the Big Bang. Now, how many young people have come to grips with their very existence through that Big Bang explosion? I mean, that, to me, that's what we're teaching our young people today.
And so there's almost now in place in our public schools a seamless plan of indoctrination from 1st grade on.
That's right.
To just, without ever questioning, without ever looking at the other side, to assume the basic tenets of evolution. Folks, we have to take a break, but when we come back, Dr. Brad will be down here with me, and we'll talk about the seriousness of the situation and what we as Christians can do about it. So don't you go away. We'll be right back.
Creation versus evolution. You weigh the evidence. Random mutations. Fabulous fossil folly. According to evolutionists, we exist because random mutations turn simple organisms into more complex creatures. If so, where are all the leftovers and mistakes? Where are all the fossils showing evolution? Through the years, we've been exposed to many hoaxes, but we haven't found one evolutionary fossil. Instead, we see millions of fossils that actually indicate creation of many distinctly different species at one time. Today's guest on Origins, Dr. Brad Harrub, is the co-founder of Focus Press Incorporated. He's also the co-editor of Think Magazine, where he's contributed many articles concerning the subject of creation. If you're searching for the truth and God's answers to life's questions, you'll want to subscribe to Think Magazine. Orders are being taken at 866-313-6474. For more information about Dr. Harrub, you can write to Focus Press Incorporated, 1600 Westgate Circle, Suite 125, Brentwood, Tennessee 37027. Or visit the website at www.focuspress.org.
Welcome back, my friends. It's so good having you with us. Dr. Brad Harrub has been with us, and he's been talking about evolution indoctrination. And Brad, we want to talk for a minute about what we as Christians, and especially Christian parents, should be doing. But before we do, just to help our folks understand the seriousness of the situation, how committed is the other side to this whole issue of a monopoly of indoctrinating our children in evolution?
Oh, the word that comes to mind would be militant.
Yes.
You know, if you look at names like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hutchinson, some of the avid writers who are definitely trying to plant seeds of atheism in the hearts and the minds of our children. For instance, I wanted to read to you a quote from Richard Lewontin just to show you how the academic world is trying to silence God. He said, "Our willingness to accept scientific claims against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural." He said, "We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity. We are forced to our adherence to materialism, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door."
That's an incredible quote. Scientific claims as opposed to scientific facts, and they violate our common sense, and they're sometimes absolutely absurd, but we must believe them anyhow.
Because we're not going to allow God's foot in the door.
Now, that's not my definition of science.
Not at all.
And there's a new book out that I've just been reading by Richard Dawkins, and you have a quote from that as well.
I do. In fact, it's The God Delusion. Stayed on the bestseller list, unfortunately, for a while. Look at how militant he is. He says, "I'm attacking God, all gods, anything and everything supernatural, wherever and whenever they have been or will be invented."
And this is he's an Englishman, but he is one of the most influential men in the world in terms of what is taught in the scientific community of children, isn't he?
Oh, he's a media darling right now.
Yeah, he's a superstar. Well, it's a scary time, Brad, but do you see hope?
Definitely. I definitely see hope. I think things are changing. You know, when you look at how vile some of these folks are, there has to be an awakening. And I think slowly we're starting to see that here in the United States. The pendulum for a long time was with people who believed the Bible. We recognized the Scopes trial, that pendulum moved to the other side. And for many, many decades, the only option our children had was evolution. That was indoctrination. Thankfully now, that pendulum is starting to move back as we look at, hey, there's other theories out there. Maybe our children need to hear about intelligent design or other origin theories. And so thankfully we do see just a little bit of movement back to the center.
Well, Brad, we're so grateful to you for your work and for sharing with us today. I hope this has been a wake-up call for a lot of our parents. And I would like to just say a word to those of you who've tuned in today, grandparents and parents, and maybe young people. You know, being scientific doesn't mean being anti-God. God is the author of science. He knows more about creation and how everything works than anyone else. And I want you to know that today there are thousands of wonderful, godly people who are engaged in the fields of science and doing a great job. Being Christian doesn't mean being anti-scientific. It means being truly educated. And I want to challenge you first to look in your own heart and say, have I been indoctrinated or have I been educated? Read some things from a creation perspective that will help you see how you can engage in critical thinking. We're not afraid of any facts that the evolutionists are putting out. Why won't they talk to us? You need to ask those kinds of questions. And you know, it's God's view that He created you, and that should be your worldview too. We'll see you next time, my friend.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint information presented today, you can download a PDF file of program number 804 from our website at www.originstv.org. Or for a DVD of this series, send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling and write to Origins Program number 804, Cornerstone Television, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.
Origins is made possible by the faithful prayers and the financial support of you, our Cornerstone Television family.